You've been sleeping with him, haven't you, Karen? John's voice was cold, cutting straight through the silence of their dining room. Karen barely flinched. She sat across from him, her manicured nails tapping lazily against her wine glass. The way she looked at him made his blood boil, cool, calm, dismissive, as if the accusation was beneath her. Are you seriously starting this again, John? It's exhausting. You're exhausting. John slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware and making the half-empty bottle of Cabernet sway dangerously. I'm not the one lying through my teeth, Karen. I'm not the one sneaking around like a cheap whore behind my husband's back. Watch your tone. Her eyes narrowed, finally showing a spark of something other than smug indifference. You don't talk to me like that. Ever. John leaned forward, pointing a trembling finger at her. Don't sit there and pretend I'm imagining things. I know you've been lying, Karen. You're not even good at it anymore. She took a measured sip of her wine before setting it down with an exaggerated sigh. Jesus Christ, John, you're so paranoid. Where's this even coming from? Because I stayed late at work last night? Because you're so insecure you can't stand the idea of me having a career that doesn't involve cooking your goddamn dinners. John's jaw clenched as he stared at the woman he'd been married to for 22 years. The same woman who, up until 6 months ago, he believed was everything he'd ever wanted. Blonde, beautiful, and sharp-tongued, Karen was the kind of woman men noticed. He knew that the moment they met. But somewhere along the line, what used to be her greatest charm turned into poison. Her wit now bitter, her laughter mocking. But she wasn't fooling him. Not anymore. It's not just one night, Karen, he hissed, his voice low. It's the way you've been acting for months. Coming home late, hiding your phone, smelling like you've rolled in another man's cologne. I'm not fucking stupid. Karen smirked, swirling her wine. Oh, so now I smell like another man? That's rich. Maybe it's just your imagination, John. Or maybe I've been buying new perfume and you're too much of a dumbass to tell the difference. That's bullshit. John's voice cracked as his anger surged, his heart pounding in his chest. You're cheating on me? I know it. I don't know who the hell he is yet, but I will find out. Karen tilted her head, her lips curving into a cold, humorless smile. You want to know what I think, John? I think you're just desperate to make yourself feel like a man again. Because you can't stand the fact that I don't need you anymore. Her words struck him like a fist to the gut. I'll find out who he is, he repeated, ignoring the sting. And when I do, you're going to regret this. She rose from her chair, wine glass in hand, and sauntered toward the kitchen. You do that, John. Knock yourself out. She stopped in the doorway, glancing back at him with those ice-blue eyes that used to set his world on fire. Oh, and you might want to calm down before you give yourself a heart attack. You're not exactly a young man anymore. Then she was gone, leaving John sitting there alone, seething. The sound of her heels clicking on the hardwood floors echoed through the house as Karen disappeared upstairs. John remained seated at the dining table, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. His pulse thudded in his ears like a war drum. She was taunting him, mocking him, that casual dismissal, like he was too pathetic to figure out what she was really up to, made his blood boil hotter than ever. He wasn't stupid, he wasn't paranoid, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let his wife, turn him into a fool. He reached for the wine bottle, pouring himself a glass with a shaking hand. The room was heavy with the tension of their argument, and yet somewhere upstairs, Karen was probably texting that bastard, smirking, laughing at him. A thought struck him like lightning. Her phone. She never let it out of her sight anymore. It was practically glued to her hand, and whenever it buzzed, she'd angle the screen away or leave the room entirely. John knew there was something on it, something she didn't want him to see. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor as he stalked toward the stairs. He'd catch her red-handed tonight. No more games. No more clever lies. John made his way up to the second floor, his socked feet silent against the carpeted hallway. The door to their bedroom was half closed, and through the gap, he could hear Karen humming to herself. She was in the bathroom, the running water muffling the sound. Perfect. He slipped inside the bedroom, his eyes immediately scanning the nightstand and the bed. Karen's phone was nowhere in sight. A wave of frustration rose in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. If she was in the bathroom, the phone was probably with her. Think John. He glanced at her purse, resting on the chair beside the closet. John lunged for it, yanking the bag open and rifling through its contents. Makeup, wallet, a pack of mints, but no phone. Looking for something? Karen's voice cut through the room like a knife, sharp and dripping with venom. John froze, his hand still inside her bag, as she appeared in the doorway. Her face was cool, but her eyes burned with anger. "What the fuck are you doing?" she hissed. John straightened slowly, his expression hard. "Where's your phone, Karen?" She barked out a laugh. "Are you serious right now? You're digging through my purse like some jealous teenager? God, you're pathetic." "Where's your phone?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Why? So you can go through my texts and convince yourself I'm screwing the UPS guy or something?" She rolled her eyes. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Where is it?" John stepped closer, and for the first time, Karen looked slightly uneasy. It was fleeting, gone in a flash, but John caught it. "Not that it's any of your business, but I left it in the car," she said, crossing her arms defensively. "I needed a break from your constant harassment." "You're lying." "Oh, for fuck's sake, John." Karen exploded, throwing her hands up. "What do you want from me? A confession? Fine. Yes, I'm having an affair. I'm fucking the entire neighborhood. Are you happy now?" The words hit John like a slap to the face. He knew she was being sarcastic, spitting the accusation back at him to make him look like the crazy one. But something about the way she said it, her tone, her eyes, her composure, left him unsettled. "I'll find out, Karen," he said quietly. "And when I do, you'll wish you'd told me the truth." "Good luck with that, Sherlock." She turned and walked toward the door, throwing a look over her shoulder as she went. "Let me know when you've solved the case." The moment she was gone, John let out a shaky breath, his anger simmering dangerously close to the surface. He needed answers. He needed proof. If she thought she could outsmart him, she was dead wrong. John barely slept that night. He lay on his side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of Karen's soft breathing. She'd fallen asleep without a care in the world, as if their argument never happened. The faint scent of her perfume, a scent he once loved, now made his stomach turn. She's lying. She's hiding something. And I'll catch her. At 2 a.m., he gave up on sleep, slipped out of bed quietly, and padded down the stairs. In the darkness of the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and thought back to her words. Casual, biting, cruel. "Knock yourself out, Sherlock." She thought she was untouchable. His mind replayed every odd moment of the last few months. The late nights, the missing dinners, her constant text notifications that she claimed were work group chats. The suspicious smile she'd give him, like she knew something he didn't. But the cologne, that was the most damning part of it all. John's hand curled around the glass. He needed to act smart. If he lashed out without proof, she'd twist it back on him, make him out to be paranoid and controlling. That was Karen's style, always making herself the victim. But if he caught her red-handed, she wouldn't be able to lie her way out of it. Her phone was the key. The next morning, Karen acted like nothing had happened. She hummed as she made herself coffee, her silk robe hanging loosely around her figure. "Morning," she said over her shoulder as John entered the kitchen. "Sleep okay?" "Fine," he replied stiffly. "Good. I have a meeting at noon, so I'll probably grab lunch with the team afterward. Don't wait up for me tonight." John stared at her. The lie rolled off her tongue, so effortlessly it sent chills down his spine. "I thought you hated working with that new manager," he said, testing her. Karen didn't miss a beat. "You do. But I can't exactly tell the boss no when he asks me to join the team for lunch." She flashed him a dazzling smile, one he'd fallen for so many years ago. "Don't worry, John. I won't be out too late." John said nothing. He just watched her, memorizing every detail. The way she avoided looking at him too long, the hint of guilt in the twitch of her mouth. By noon, John was parked 2 blocks away from Karen's office, sitting in his truck waiting. He saw her leave the building 15 minutes later, looking picture-perfect in a fitted skirt and heels, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. She wasn't alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp suit followed close behind her. John's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the man opened the passenger door of a black BMW for Karen. She slid in with a laugh. One of those soft, flirtatious laughs she hadn't used with John in years. His heart dropped into his stomach as the car pulled away. "Got you, you bitch," he muttered under his breath, turning the ignition. He followed at a distance, keeping the BMW in sight. His palms were sweaty, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Part of him hoped this was just some business associate, someone innocent. But deep down, he knew better. The BMW pulled into the parking lot of a fancy downtown hotel. John parked across the street, watching as the man handed his keys to the valet and led Karen inside. There was no hesitation, no subtlety. They weren't worried about being seen. "Because she thinks I'm too dumb to figure it out." John sat frozen for a moment, staring at the hotel entrance. He could feel the heat rising in his face. His teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. This was it. Proof. He grabbed his phone and snapped a photo of the two of them entering the building together. His hands shook as he stared at the image. Karen's hand brushing against the man's arm, her head tilted back in laughter. The woman he'd loved for over 2 decades. The woman he'd trusted with everything. The rage boiled inside him, sharp and consuming, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to play the smart. He couldn't confront her here, not yet. No, he'd wait. Let her think she was getting away with it. But when the time came, he'd make her pay. Hours later, Karen breezed through the front door like nothing had happened, humming the same tune she had that morning. She dropped her purse on the counter and kicked off her heels, giving him a quick smile as he sat in his recliner, pretending to watch TV. "Long day?" she asked sweetly. "Yeah," John replied, his voice steady. "How was lunch?" She didn't even flinch. "Boring. You know how these work things are." She was a masterful liar. Karen walked over and kissed him on the cheek before heading upstairs, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in her wake. It wasn't hers. It was his. John's grip tightened around the remote, his eyes fixed on the screen, though he wasn't watching a damn thing. She thought she was untouchable. She thought he was blind. But Karen had no idea the storm that was coming. John woke up early the next morning, far earlier than usual, his mind still humming with the memory of Karen's deceit. He stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, her laughter replaying in his head like a mocking echo. That hotel, her delicate hand brushing against that man's arm, was seared into his brain. He didn't even confront her that night. He couldn't trust himself to. He wanted her to keep thinking he was the oblivious, pathetic husband. But John wasn't stupid, and he sure as hell wasn't done. By the time Karen woke up and walked into the kitchen in her silk robe, John was already sitting at the table with his coffee and a newspaper spread out in front of him. "You're up early," she said, her voice light as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, not looking up. Karen murmured, running a hand through her perfectly tousled hair. "I'm heading into the office for a bit today. I might meet some of the girls for brunch afterward." John smiled tightly. "Another lie." "That's nice," he said evenly. "Tell them I said hello." Karen froze for the briefest of moments, her back still turned to him. It was just a fraction of a second, but John noticed. She composed herself quickly and turned to face him with that same cool, condescending smile she always wore. "Of course. Don't burn the house down while I'm gone." John chuckled softly, though there was nothing funny about it. "Don't worry. I'll manage." An hour later, John watched from the upstairs window as Karen's car pulled out of the driveway. He waited until she turned the corner at the end of the street before grabbing his keys and heading out the door. He didn't follow her this time. He didn't need to. He already knew exactly where she was going. Instead, he drove across town to a small strip mall where an unassuming electronics shop sat wedged between a dry cleaner and a pizza joint. Inside, a man with a scruffy beard and tired eyes looked up from the counter as the bell over the door jingled. "Morning," John said, approaching the counter. "Morning. What can I do for you?" John pulled Karen's laptop out of the messenger bag, slung over his shoulder, and set it on the counter. "I need you to recover anything deleted off of this. Emails, messages, whatever you can find." The man raised an eyebrow. "You think there's something worth finding?" John's jaw tightened. "I know there is." The man shrugged and pulled the laptop closer. "This might take a while. You want me to call you when I'm done?" John shook his head. I'll wait. 2 hours later, John sat in his truck in the parking lot, staring at the file of printed messages the tech guy had handed him. His hands shook as he flipped through page after page of emails, texts, and photos Karen had thought she'd erased. It was all there, every sordid detail. The man's name was Derek Whitman, a coworker, a high-level client Karen had been entertaining on and off for months under the guise of professional meetings. There were long, detailed emails filled with playful banter and thinly veiled sexual innuendo. Then there were the texts, raw, dirty messages that made John's stomach churn. Photos, too, of Karen dressed in lingerie. His Karen. The same lingerie he'd bought her last Christmas. And Derek wasn't shy about reciprocating. There were plenty of photos of him, too, shirtless, posing smugly in front of a bathroom mirror like some kind of teenage boy. John could barely breathe as he sat there, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The betrayal he'd suspected had just been confirmed, and it was worse than he'd imagined. His wife wasn't just cheating on him, she was enjoying it, flaunting it, laughing behind his back while she sucked another man's dick. John slammed his fist against the steering wheel, letting out a guttural yell that filled the cab of the truck. The rage coursing through him was white-hot and dangerous, but beneath it all was something else, something cold and calculating. You think you've won, Karen? He stared down at the printed text, his lips curling into a bitter smile. You're going to regret this, you lying bitch. When John got home, Karen was already there. She sat on the living room couch, her phone in hand as she scrolled through something, barely acknowledging him when he walked in. You're home early, she said absently. John set his keys on the counter and shrugged. Yeah, not much going on at work today. Karen finally looked up, studying him for a moment. You okay? John forced a smile, hiding the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. I'm fine. Just tired. Karen nodded and went back to her phone, completely unaware of the pages of filth John had sitting in his truck outside. For the rest of the evening, John pretended everything was normal. He cooked dinner, asked her about her day, and even laughed at a stupid joke she made. Karen, for her part, seemed perfectly at ease, never once suspecting what John knew. But as he watched her sip wine across the table, smiling at him like the devoted wife she pretended to be, John's resolve solidified. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to cry. And he sure as hell wasn't going to let her think she'd won. The following morning, John felt sharper than he had in months. The anger still burned, but it was no longer wild and unchecked. It had cooled into something precise and focused. Karen's lies had made him blind for too long, but now he saw her for exactly who she was. And as much as it hurt to admit it, his marriage wasn't about love anymore. It was about revenge. The key to revenge wasn't lashing out. It was waiting for the right moment to destroy her piece by piece. John stood in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, as Karen strolled in, dressed in another one of her tight pencil skirts that hugged every curve. She wore it for him, of course. Not John, the man she was sneaking off to meet. Derek. Morning, she said, smiling faintly. She moved to pour herself a cup of coffee, her movements confident, deliberate. You're up early again. What's with you lately? John forced a casual shrug. I've been thinking about getting back into the gym, maybe starting a new routine. Karen glanced at him over her shoulder, her lips twitching. Oh, trying to impress someone? The irony of her joke almost made him laugh. He sipped his coffee instead, forcing himself to stay calm. Nah, just trying to take better care of myself. Karen nodded absently, clearly uninterested. She grabbed her bag and slipped on her heels, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. I'm meeting with some of the team this afternoon, so I might not be home until later tonight. Another lie. John stared at her, his face neutral. Sounds good. Drive safe. She paused, slightly thrown off by his calm demeanor, but shook it off quickly. Will do. Bye, hon. She walked out the door without another word, her perfume lingering in her wake. John waited until the sound of her car faded into the distance before grabbing his phone. It was time to start putting his plan in motion. An hour later, John sat in a diner across town, his laptop open in front of him, and Karen's printed messages spread across the table. He'd read through every filthy word Derek and Karen exchanged a dozen times, each line a nail in the coffin of his trust. But now, these messages were more than just painful. They were evidence. John clicked through a website he'd found late last night, a divorce attorney's page with an emphasis on adultery cases. The site boasted success stories of men who'd walked away with everything: the house, the savings, custody of their kids, while their cheating wives were left with scraps. That was going to be Karen. John reached for his coffee as his phone buzzed with a text. It was from his buddy, Todd, the only person John trusted enough to involve in his plan. "Todd, you sure you want to go through with this, man?" John stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. "Me? I'm sure." That afternoon, John followed Karen again. He tailed her car at a safe distance as she drove downtown, taking turns without hesitation, as if she hadn't a care in the world. She was meeting Derek again. John just knew it. Sure enough, she pulled into the parking garage of the same hotel. John parked across the street and watched as Karen stepped out of her car. She paused to check her reflection in the window, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her blouse before heading inside. The rage returned, raw and blistering. This is what she thinks of me. This is how little I mean to her. John grabbed his phone and snapped more photos. Karen walking into the lobby, her hips swaying, her face glowing with anticipation. For him, this time John didn't just sit back and watch. He needed more than pictures. He needed something irrefutable. Heart pounding, he climbed out of his truck and crossed the street, entering the hotel lobby. It was upscale, with a faint scent of lavender hanging in the air and polished marble floors gleaming under the chandeliers. John's fists clenched as he imagined Derek and Karen upstairs, laughing at him. The receptionist looked up as he approached the front desk. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you?" "Yes," John said, his voice steady. "I believe my wife is here. Karen Monroe. She's meeting a man named Derek Whitman. I'm not looking for trouble, but I'd appreciate knowing which room they're in." The receptionist blinked, clearly startled. "Sir, I'm afraid we can't disclose that kind of information." John smiled politely. "I understand. It's just that we're going through a rough patch in our marriage, and I have a feeling she's meeting him well, you know." The receptionist hesitated, her face softening slightly. John could tell she was uncomfortable, but he leaned into it. "Look, I don't want to cause a scene. I just want to know the truth," he said quietly. "Please." After a long moment, the receptionist sighed. "I can't tell you the room number, but they checked in about 20 minutes ago." John's chest tightened. He had them. "Thank you," he said, turning back toward the lobby doors. He walked briskly back to his truck, his mind racing. If he confronted them now, everything would unravel too soon. He wasn't ready yet. Not until he'd secured his position and made sure Karen paid dearly for what she'd done. Instead, John pulled out his phone and dialed Todd. "Hey, it's me," he said the moment Todd answered. "What's going on?" Todd asked. John stared at the hotel entrance, where Karen and Derek were likely holed up, fucking like rabbits without a care in the world. "I need a favor," John said, his voice ice cold. "I want you to give me a PI. Someone good. Someone who can follow her and get me everything. Pictures, videos, times, dates. I want this airtight." Todd exhaled sharply. "You're really going for the kill, huh?" John's grip on the phone tightened. "You're damn right I am." That night, when Karen came home, she was all smiles again. She greeted John with a kiss on the cheek, acting like the perfect wife. "Sorry I was late. Work ran long." John turned to look at her, masking his contempt with an easy smile. "That's okay. I didn't even notice." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly suspicious, but didn't say anything. She disappeared upstairs a moment later, leaving John alone in the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat at the table, the photo of her entering the hotel still fresh in his mind. She thought she was in control, that she was untouchable. But soon, Karen was going to learn what it felt like to lose everything. John's movements were mechanical over the next few days, like a man possessed. He played the role of the oblivious husband perfectly. He smiled when Karen waltzed through the door after her late nights at work, kissed her cheek when she offered it, and nodded along as she spewed lie after lie. But all the while, his plan was unfolding in the shadows. Todd came through quickly. The private investigator, someone John had only heard of in whispered circles, was named Mark Clayton. He was expensive, discreet, and ruthless, the kind of guy who didn't ask questions or offer unsolicited advice. Exactly what John needed. Sitting across from Mark in a dingy office downtown, John laid it all out. The suspicions, the hotel, the texts, the photos. "I need everything on her and this guy," John said, his voice tight and low. "Where they meet, when, how often. I want pictures, videos, anything you can get me." Mark nodded, his face unreadable. "You'll get your evidence, Mr. Monroe. I'll be in touch." 3 days later, John sat in his truck outside the hardware store when his phone buzzed with a message. "Mark, check your email." His heart kicked into a brutal rhythm as he opened his inbox. The message from Mark was short, just a link and the words, "Be ready for this." John clicked the link. A gallery of images loaded on his phone. Each photo chipped away at whatever hope he still had left. Karen and Derek leaving the hotel together. Karen, her hand resting on Derek's chest as he leaned in close, whispering something in her ear. A shot of the two of them through a window. Karen laughing, a wine glass in hand as Derek sat beside her with his arm casually draped over the back of her chair. Then came the worst of it. Photos of them in Derek's car, parked behind the hotel, her face buried in his neck as he grabbed a fistful of her hair and kissed her. Another showed her straddling him, her blouse unbuttoned, his hands sliding up her thighs. John's vision blurred as he stared at the screen, his hand shaking violently. She didn't even try to hide it. And the videos were worse. One was a grainy clip from the parking garage. Karen stepping out of Derek's car, her skirt rumpled, her lipstick smeared, as she adjusted herself before strutting back to her own vehicle like nothing had happened. The other was from the hotel lobby. Karen leaning over the counter, laughing with Derek as they picked up their room key. Her wedding ring, a symbol of their life together, gleamed on her finger the whole time. John couldn't breathe. His entire chest felt like it was caving in. He closed his phone and set it on the passenger seat, staring blankly at the rain streaking down his windshield. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. He had proof. Cold, undeniable proof. For a moment, John thought about confronting her right then and there. He could storm into the house, shove the photos in her face, scream at her until her mask cracked and she admitted what she'd done. But no, that wasn't enough. Karen didn't deserve an argument. She didn't deserve a second chance to talk her way out of it, to gaslight him into thinking it was somehow his fault. She deserved to lose everything. That night, John went through the motions of their evening routine like nothing had changed. Karen cooked dinner, pan-seared salmon with a side of roasted vegetables. John sat at the table, watching her move around the kitchen with practiced ease, like the perfect wife she pretended to be. "So," she said, setting a plate in front of him, "I was thinking we should plan a trip soon. Maybe a weekend getaway to the lake house." John looked up at her, forcing himself to smile. "That sounds nice." Karen smiled back, her expression so genuine it almost made him sick. "I thought so. We've been so busy lately, and I think we could use some time to reconnect." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. Reconnect. She wanted to reconnect with him after spending her afternoons fucking Derek Whitman in a hotel room. "Sure," John said, cutting into his salmon. "Let's plan for next month." Karen beamed, oblivious to the storm raging behind his calm exterior. John spent the next few days gathering everything he needed. He printed the photos, the texts, and Mark's full report. He spoke to his lawyer, a shrewd man named Alan Harris, and laid out every piece of evidence. Alan's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "This is solid, John. Your wife won't have a leg to stand on in court. With this kind of proof, we'll make sure she walks away with nothing." John nodded, his face set like stone. "That's what I want." Alan hesitated. "You sure about this? Once we start the process, there's no turning back." John stared at him, unblinking. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That Friday evening, John sat on the living room couch with a glass of whiskey in hand, waiting. Karen had texted him 2 hours ago to say she was working late again. He knew exactly where she was. When her car finally pulled into the driveway, John took a slow sip of his drink, savoring the burn, and set the glass down. The front door creaked open. "Hey, honey," Karen called out, her voice cheerful. "Sorry I'm late." Long day. John stood as she walked into the living room, still dressed in the same tight pencil skirt and heels she'd worn that morning. She set her purse on the counter and turned to him with a soft smile. "You're drinking tonight?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's not like you." John smiled back. "It's been a long week." Karen started to say something else, but she froze when she noticed the folder sitting on the coffee table. It was open, the photos and printed text spread out in plain view. Her face went pale. What is this?" John didn't move, his expression cold and unfeeling. "Go ahead. Take a look." Karen's eyes darted to the photos, widening as she realized what she was seeing. Herself and Derek caught in the act. Her hands began to shake as she reached for one of the pages, her breathing ragged. "John, I can explain." "Don't," John snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Don't you dare stand there and lie to me again." Karen swallowed hard, her face crumbling. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," John said coldly. He grabbed a manila envelope from the table and tossed it at her feet. "That's your copy of the divorce papers. You'll find everything spelled out nice and clear. My lawyer will contact you on Monday." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Tears welled in her eyes, but John didn't care. "Not anymore." "You thought I wouldn't find out?" he said, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could screw him behind my back and get away with it? You're a joke, Karen, and now you're going to pay for it." She sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands as she began to sob. But John didn't stay to watch. He grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal. John drove aimlessly for hours after leaving the house. The satisfaction of confronting Karen had been short-lived. Her face, crumbling under the weight of her lies, had given him a fleeting sense of justice, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The quiet hum of the truck's engine filled the silence as he gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at the road ahead. He couldn't stop picturing them, Karen and Derek, her hands on him, her laugh, the way she adjusted her skirt like it was routine, like he didn't exist. The betrayal ate at him like acid. He had given her 22 years of his life. 22 goddamn years. And she'd thrown it all away without so much as a hint of remorse. John pulled into the parking lot of a rundown bar on the edge of town. It wasn't his usual spot, but tonight he didn't care. He needed the burn of whiskey to drown out the storm in his head. Inside, the bar was dim and half empty. The bartender barely looked up as John dropped onto a stool and ordered a double. He downed it in one long gulp, the heat spreading through his chest like wildfire. Rough night. John turned to see a man a few seats down nursing a beer, watching him with mild curiosity. He was in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen his fair share of hard days. "You could say that," John muttered, signaling for another drink. "Women, huh?" The man smirked, taking a sip of his beer. "They'll tear you apart and smile while they do it." John's jaw tightened. He glanced over at the man, suddenly curious. "That happened to you?" The man laughed bitterly. "Oh yeah, my ex-wife screwed half her office before I caught her. Thought she was so damn clever. I took her for every penny she had when I divorced her, though." John stared into his glass, the man's words resonating in the deepest, darkest parts of him. "Took her for every penny. That must have felt good," John said quietly. The man shrugged. "It didn't fix everything. But watching her cry when she realized she'd lost the house? Yeah, that felt pretty damn good." John thought of Karen, sobbing on the couch as the divorce papers lay at her feet. He thought of the way her confidence had shattered the moment she realized he wasn't the fool she took him for. But it wasn't enough. "Let me ask you something," John said, turning to the man. "If you could have done more, if you could have really ruined her, would you have done it?" The man's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with something dark. In a heartbeat. John finished his drink, the burn of the whiskey no longer enough to satisfy him. He stood abruptly, tossing some cash onto the bar. "Thanks for the advice." The man raised his beer in mock salute. "Anytime, friend. Good luck." By the time John returned home, it was past midnight. The house was dark except for a faint glow coming from the living room. Karen was still there, curled up on the couch, the manila envelope clutched in her lap. Her mascara-streaked face was a mess, and her red-rimmed eyes looked up at him as he stepped inside. "You can't do this, John," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please. We can fix this." John shut the door behind him, his expression blank. "There's nothing left to fix, Karen. I made a mistake," she pleaded, rising shakily to her feet. "It didn't mean anything. I was lonely, John. You've been so distant and—" "Stop." John's voice cut through her excuses like a knife. He stepped toward her, his eyes cold and unrelenting. "Don't stand there and try to blame this on me. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. Over and over again. You knew exactly what you were doing." Karen's lip trembled, but John wasn't finished. "I gave you everything, Karen. I trusted you. I built this life with you. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with some co-worker, like a goddamn cliché." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "I didn't want to hurt you, John." "Well, you did," he snapped. "You didn't care who you hurt as long as you got what you wanted." Karen sank back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For the first time, she didn't have a clever comeback, a smug smile, or a lie ready to deflect the truth. John stood over her, feeling nothing but disgust. "This isn't just about divorce, Karen," he said quietly. "You're going to lose everything. The house, the savings, everything we built together. You'll be lucky if you can afford a shitty apartment when I'm done." Karen looked up at him, her face pale and stricken. "John, you don't have to do this. We can find a way to move past this. I'll do whatever it takes." John stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "I want you to remember something, Karen. Every time you're sitting alone in some cheap, empty apartment, every time you wake up in the middle of the night and realize you have no one left, you did this. You chose this." Karen let out a sob, collapsing back onto the couch as John turned and walked toward the stairs. He paused at the bottom step, glancing over his shoulder one last time. "Oh, and Karen?" She looked up, her tear-streaked face hollow and broken. "Derek won't be there to save you," John said with a bitter smile. "He'll drop you the second he realizes you're nothing but a liability." Karen's face crumpled, but John didn't wait to see her reaction. He climbed the stairs without another word, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her lies. Upstairs, John stood at the window, staring out into the night. He destroyed her tonight, cracked her perfect facade, and left her with nothing. But he wasn't done yet. No, not by a long shot. John woke early the next morning, feeling oddly refreshed despite the chaos of the previous night. The house was silent. Karen hadn't moved from the couch. He didn't check on her. He didn't care to. In the kitchen, John poured himself a cup of coffee and glanced out the window at the early morning light streaking across the lawn. The calm of the morning mocked him, as if the world didn't know or care that his life had fallen apart. But today was a new day, and he had work to do. John spent the morning meeting with Alan, his lawyer, to finalize the divorce strategy. Alan had a keen eye for detail and a ruthless approach to family law. He flipped through the evidence John provided, photos, texts, video footage, with a grim expression. "This will seal it," Alan said, leaning back in his chair. "She won't have a leg to stand on. You'll get the house, the savings, and any other joint assets. She'll walk away with nothing but her name." "Good," John replied flatly. "And the affair partner?" Alan added, tapping the file. "Derek Whitman. Do you want me to loop his employer into this? Adultery, especially between co-workers, can cause a lot of professional fallout." John thought about that for a moment. The image of Derek's smug face appeared in his mind, his hands all over Karen, his cocky grin as if he'd won some twisted game. "Do it," John said darkly. "Burn him too." Alan smirked. "Consider it done." When John returned home later that afternoon, the house was still quiet. Karen was no longer on the couch. Instead, he found her upstairs in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with red, swollen eyes. Her gaze flickered toward him when he walked in, and for a moment, she looked almost human, vulnerable, even. "John," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Can we talk?" John stared at her coldly. "We have nothing to talk about." Karen flinched. "Please. I need to explain." "No," John interrupted, stepping closer. "You had months to explain, Karen. months to tell me the truth, to come clean. Instead, you laughed in my face and fucked another man in hotel rooms I paid for." She let out a small, broken sound, but John wasn't finished. "You want to talk now? Now that you're caught? Now that you've lost?" He shook his head, his voice dripping with disdain. "Save your tears. I don't believe a damn word you say." Karen buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. John turned and left the room without another word. He didn't care anymore, not about her tears, her regret, or her pathetic attempts to justify what she'd done. She'd made her bed. Now she could lie in it alone. The following day, the next phase of John's plan fell into place. Karen's lover, Derek Whitman, was about to learn that actions had consequences. John had given Alan the green light to send an anonymous email to Derek's employer, a large corporate firm with a strict code of conduct policy. Attached to the email were photos of Derek and Karen entering the hotel together, time-stamped texts, and a detailed report of the affair. By the time Derek received a panic call from his boss, John was already enjoying his second cup of coffee. The fallout was swift and brutal. Derek was summoned into an emergency meeting, blindsided by the accusations. His charm and smug grin were no match for hard evidence. The company couldn't risk a scandal, especially with Karen being tied to one of their biggest accounts. By noon, Derek had been escorted out of the building. Fired. Karen was next. That evening, John sat in his recliner, sipping whiskey as Karen paced the living room, her phone clutched in her hand. She'd been on edge all day, her voice shrill and desperate as she tried to reach Derek. "He's not answering," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "He's not answering, John." John smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Maybe he's busy. Or maybe he realized you're not worth the trouble." Karen's head snapped toward him, her eyes wild. "You did this, didn't you?" John raised an eyebrow. "Did what?" "You ruined him," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You God. You're such a petty, vindictive bastard." John set his glass down, rising slowly from the chair. "Petty," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Petty is sneaking around like a whore and thinking you're too clever to get caught. Petty is blaming me for your choices. You destroyed this marriage, Karen. Not me." Karen staggered back as if he'd slapped her, the fight draining from her in an instant. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as fresh sobs racked her body. John watched her for a moment, feeling nothing. No pity, no sympathy, just a cold sense of satisfaction. "You'll hear from my lawyers soon," he said, his voice flat. "The divorce is moving forward, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of woman you are." Karen didn't respond. She just curled into herself, her shoulders shaking. John turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy against the floor. Upstairs, he grabbed his phone and dialed Mark, the private investigator. "It's done," he said when Mark answered. "Derek's out of the picture. I need you to take care of one more thing." "Name it," Mark replied. John's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I want you to leak everything. The texts, the photos, the videos, send it to her friends, her co-workers, everyone she knows. Make sure she can't show her face without them seeing what she really is." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mark replied, his tone impressed. "You're a cold man, Mr. Monroe." John's smile didn't waver. Not as cold as she was. The next morning, Karen's world imploded. It started with a flurry of phone calls and texts from her friends and colleagues, panicked, angry, disgusted. Someone had leaked everything. The affair, the photos, the messages. Her perfect image was shattered in an instant. By the time Karen stumbled into the kitchen, clutching her phone like a lifeline, her face was pale and blotchy. She looked at John, tears streaming down her cheeks. You ruined me," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. John met her gaze, his expression cold and unfeeling. "No, Karen, you ruined yourself. I just made sure everyone else saw it." Karen's sobs echoed through the house as John picked up his coffee cup and walked past her, a cruel sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. She had betrayed him, lied to him, made him feel like nothing. But now Karen was the one with nothing. Karen didn't leave the house for 2 days. She stayed locked in the bedroom, blinds drawn, hiding from the fallout. John could hear her crying sometimes, soft, broken sobs that echoed faintly through the walls. Once upon a time, hearing her like that would have gutted him, but now, he felt nothing. The texts and calls kept coming for her. Friends who once adored her turned on her overnight, their messages laced with judgment and disgust. "How could you do this? You're pathetic. Don't ever talk to me again." Her sister called to say their parents were furious, too embarrassed to show their faces at church. The perfect, polished image Karen had spent her life crafting was shattered, and there was no gluing it back together. And Derek? He was gone. She tried calling him a dozen times, leaving desperate voicemails filled with panicked pleas. "Please, Derek, I need you. Call me back." But Derek never answered. John had made sure of that. One of Derek's coworkers, someone with loose lips and no loyalty, told a mutual acquaintance that Derek had packed up and left town, his reputation in tatters. His career was finished. He was single and unemployed, and for the first time in months, Karen was completely alone. Exactly as John wanted her. By the third day, she emerged from the bedroom, a fragile ghost of the woman she once was. Her hair was unbrushed, her face pale, dark circles carved beneath her swollen eyes. She stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching the frame like it was the only thing holding her up. John was at the table, drinking his morning coffee and reading the paper, pretending she didn't exist. "John." Her voice was hoarse and small, barely audible. He didn't look up. "What? Please." She hesitated, her voice trembling. "Please, can we just talk?" John set his mug down, finally lifting his gaze to her. The sight of her, broken, weak, should have satisfied him, but there was still a dark hollowness in his chest that even her misery couldn't fill. "What is there to talk about, Karen?" he asked coldly. "We're done." Her lip trembled. "I know I hurt you, John. I know I ruined everything, but I never wanted this. I never wanted to get caught." John interrupted, his voice sharp. "Is that what you mean? You never wanted me to find out?" Karen shook her head violently, tears welling in her bloodshot eyes. "No, it wasn't like that. I was stupid. I made a mistake. You made a choice." John stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You chose him over me. Over us. You threw away 22 years for what? A few cheap afternoons in a hotel room?" Karen flinched, her shoulders shaking. "I wasn't thinking." "You were thinking," John snapped, stepping closer. "You were thinking every time you got dressed up for him. Every time you lied to my face. Every time you kissed me with his stink still on you." Karen let out a strangled sob, collapsing onto the kitchen floor. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, John." He stared down at her, unmoved. Once, he'd loved this woman more than life itself. Once, he'd have given anything to see her happy. But now? Now all he felt was disgust. "You're only sorry because you lost," he said quietly. Karen looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "I'll do anything," she whispered. "Anything to fix this. Please." John laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "There's no fixing this, Karen. You didn't just break our marriage. You burned it to the ground. And I'm the one walking away with everything while you're sifting through the ashes." She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. John turned and walked toward the door, grabbing his keys from the counter. "Where are you going?" Karen choked out. "Out," he said over his shoulder. "Unlike you, I don't need to explain where I go or who I see." Karen didn't respond. She just curled into herself, broken and defeated, as John left the house without another word. John spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, his thoughts racing. He should have felt better, satisfied, even, but the truth gnawed at him like a splinter under his skin. Karen's misery wasn't enough. Not yet. He thought about the affair, the betrayal, the texts, and the smug look on Derek's face in those photos. He thought about Karen's voice, soft and pleading, begging for forgiveness that she didn't deserve. He couldn't stop replaying it all in his head, and the anger surged anew, hot and blinding. John pulled his truck into the parking lot of a bar and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He needed to calm down. He needed a drink. Inside, the bar was dim and quiet, the kind of place where people went to forget. John slid onto a stool and ordered a whiskey, downing the first glass in one gulp. The bartender, a burly man with a scruffy beard, raised an eyebrow. "Rough day." John let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that." The bartender poured him another drink, setting the glass in front of him. "Whatever it is, it'll pass." John stared into the amber liquid, his mind swirling with thoughts. Will it? As the hours passed and the whiskey numbed his edges, John felt a strange sense of clarity. He'd spent the last few weeks destroying Karen piece by piece, and it wasn't over yet. But what came after? The truth hit him like a gut punch. There was nothing left. Their life, their marriage, it was all gone. Karen had ruined it, and he'd finished what she started. Now he was standing alone in the wreckage, with nothing but an empty house and the bitter satisfaction of revenge to keep him company. And for the first time, John wondered if he'd truly won. When John finally returned home late that night, the house was silent and dark. He stumbled into the kitchen, his footsteps heavy, and froze when he saw the note on the counter. It was written in Karen's handwriting, the letters shaky and smudged with faint tear stains. "John, I can't do this anymore. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I can't stay here, not like this. I'm leaving. I hope someday you can forgive me. Karen." John stared at the note for a long moment, his mind blank. He felt nothing. No anger, no relief, no sadness. Just an empty void where his marriage used to be. He crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash, pouring himself another drink before collapsing onto the couch. The house felt colder than it ever had before, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Karen was gone, and for the first time in weeks, John realized just how alone he truly was. John woke to the morning sun streaming through the window, the empty whiskey glass still clutched in his hand. His head throbbed with the familiar dull ache of too much drinking, but it wasn't the hangover that bothered him. It was the crushing silence of the house. Karen was really gone. He sat up slowly, his body stiff and aching, the events of the last few days hitting him all over again. Revenge had been his fuel, his purpose, and now that he had it, now that Karen was out of his life, destroyed and disgraced, he didn't know what to do with himself. The house felt cavernous without her. Every room was still hers in some way. The scented candles she'd loved, the throw blanket she'd curled up under during movie nights, the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered upstairs. No, don't go there, he thought bitterly, forcing himself to his feet. He wasn't about to start romanticizing the woman who'd torn his life apart. She'd done this. Over the next few days, John threw himself into a routine. He went back to work, showed up early, stayed late. His coworkers noticed a shift in him, a harder edge to his tone, a coldness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. "You all right, man?" Todd asked one afternoon, leaning against John's truck after work. "I'm fine," John replied curtly, lighting a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in years, but lately it gave him something to do, something to focus on. Todd studied him for a long moment, shaking his head. "You don't look fine. You look like a guy who's barely holding it together." John exhaled a stream of smoke, his jaw tight. "What do you want me to say, Todd? That I'm broken? That I can't stop thinking about her?" Todd hesitated before speaking. "Look, I know what she did was unforgivable, but you won, man. You took her down. You've got the house, the savings. You've got everything." John scoffed, flicking the cigarette to the ground. "Yeah, and I've got a big empty house to show for it. Some victory." Todd didn't say anything else. He just clapped John on the shoulder and walked off, leaving him standing there alone with his thoughts. That night, John sat at the dining table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He stared at the framed photo on the far wall, a picture of him and Karen taken years ago during a trip to the mountains. She was smiling in the photo, her arms wrapped around him, her cheeks flushed from the cold. It didn't even look like the same woman. With a growl of frustration, John grabbed the frame and hurled it across the room. The glass shattered, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. He sat there for a long time, staring at the broken frame, the photo lying face down on the floor. What the hell am I doing? A week passed, and John's life became painfully monotonous. Work, drink, sleep, repeat. The satisfaction he'd felt watching Karen crumble was long gone. replaced by an emptiness he couldn't shake. One evening, as he sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, his phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was an unknown number. John frowned and picked it up, answering gruffly. "Hello, John." He froze, the voice hitting him like a punch to the gut. It was Karen. "What do you want?" he snapped, his hand tightening around the phone. There was a pause on the other end before she spoke again, her voice trembling. I just wanted to hear your voice." John laughed bitterly. "Why? So you can pretend you didn't screw me over?" "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said softly. "I don't expect it, but I need you to know that I loved you, John. I still love you." "Don't," he hissed, his voice shaking with anger. "Don't you dare say that to me." "It's the truth," she whispered. "I ruined everything, and I'll never stop regretting it. But you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I needed you to know that." John clenched his jaw, his chest tight. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she was a liar and a coward, but the words wouldn't come. "You should have thought of that before you spread your legs for another man," he said finally, his voice cold. Karen let out a small, broken sound like she'd been punched in the gut. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered. "Goodbye." The line went dead. John stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it down, his hands trembling. He wanted to feel triumphant, to relish the sound of her broken voice, but all he felt was hollow. The days stretched into weeks. John stopped drinking so much, stopped sitting in the dark brooding over the past. He threw out the remnants of Karen's presence, the photos, the clothes she'd left behind, the perfume bottles that still lined the bathroom counter. He scrubbed her out of the house, room by room, until it was no longer hers. But the house still felt empty. Some nights, he found himself sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, wondering how it had all come to this. He'd gotten his revenge. He destroyed Karen's life the way she destroyed his. So, why didn't he feel better? The truth was simple, and it gnawed at him every time he sat alone in the dark. Revenge doesn't fix anything. Karen was gone. Derek was ruined. And John was still here, living in the wreckage of what used to be his life. He thought about her words that night on the phone, the tremble in her voice when she said she still loved him. Maybe it was a lie, or maybe it was the truth, but it didn't matter now. Some things couldn't be undone.